The Huntsman by Edward Lowbury. Kagwa hunted the lion. Through bush and forest went his spear. One day he found the skull of a man and said to it, "How did you come here?" The skull opened its mouth and said, "Talking brought me here." Kagwa hurried home, went to the king's chair and spoke. "In the forest I found a talking skull." The king was silent. Then he said slowly, "Never since I was born of my mother have I seen or heard of a skull which spoke." The king called out his guards. "Two of you now go with him and find this talking skull. But if his tale is a lie and the skull speaks no word, this Kagwa himself must die." They rode into the forest. For days and nights they found nothing. At last they saw the skull. Kagwa said to it, "How did you come here?" The skull said nothing. Kagwa implored, but the skull said nothing. The guard said, "Kneel down." They killed him with sword and spear. Then the skull opened its mouth. "Huntsman, how did you come here?" And the dead man answered, "Talking brought me here." The Huntsman by Edward Lowbury. Edward Lowbury was an English medical bacteriologist and pathologist as well as a published poet. He was born in 1913 in London and was educated at St. Paul's School in the same city. He later pursued higher studies at University College, Oxford, where he won the War Memorial Medical Scholarship. Lowbury was a pioneer in the field of burns infection, antibiotic resistance, and skin disinfection, and made significant contributions to the treatment of burns and related infections. In 1943, Lowbury joined the RAMC as a specialist in pathology with the rank of Major and served in the UK and East Africa during World War II. During his time in Kenya, he developed a particular interest in witch doctoring and folk medicine. After the war, he spent 30 years as a specialist in the treatment of burns and related infections at the Birmingham Accident Hospital. Lowbury was not only a respected medical professional, but also a published poet. He wrote several collections of poetry throughout his lifetime, and his work was known for its vivid imagery and emotional impact. He passed away in 2007. Edward Lowbury led a dual career as both a respected medical professional and a prolific poet. His love for poetry was ignited at a young age, and he went on to publish numerous volumes of his work. Lowbury's passion for poetry was evident even during his undergraduate studies, as he published his first collection in 1936 while still in university. He was known to carry a notebook with him at all times, using one end to jot down medical ideas and the other to capture inspiration for his poems. His poetry was celebrated for its rich imagery and emotional depth. The Huntsman by Edward Lowbury. Kagwa hunted the lion. Through bush and forest went his spear. One day he found the skull of a man and said to it, "How did you come here?" The skull opened its mouth and said, "Talking brought me here." Kagwa hurried home, went to the king's chair and spoke. In the forest, I found a talking skull. The king was silent. Then he said slowly, "Never since I was born of my mother have I seen or heard of a skull which spoke." The king called out his guards. "Two of you now go with him and find this talking skull. But if his tale is a lie and the skull speaks no word, this Kagwa himself must die." They rode into the forest. For days and nights they found nothing. At last they saw the skull. Kagwa said to it, "How did you come here?" The skull said nothing. Kagwa implored, but the skull said nothing. The guard said, "Kneel down." They killed him with sword and spear. Then the skull opened its mouth. "Huntsman, how did you come here?" And the dead man answered, "Talking brought me here." In the first verse of the poem, the writer introduces a very skilled and brave huntsman called Kagwa. Kagwa hunted the lion through bush and forest went his spear. These lines suggest that he is not afraid of pursuing dangerous games through challenging terrain. His hunting expedition takes a dark turn when he discovers the skull of a man. The discovery of the skull in the midst of Kagwa's hunting expedition adds a sense of danger and foreboding to the scene. The skull can be symbolic of a reminder of the inevitability of death and impermanency of all things. In some cultures, especially in tribal cultures, the skull can be associated with superstition and beliefs in the supernatural. The skull's response to Kagwa's question, "Talking brought me here," suggests that the man may have talked too much and his words may have caused his downfall. Kagwa's pursuit of the lion may be seen as a metaphor for the pursuit of glory and fame. The fact that Kagwa hurries home and reports the discovery of the talking skull to the king suggests the incident has had a significant impact on him. Why do you think that Kagwa reported it to the king? Firstly, it can be out of sense of duty or obligation. Secondly, he was deeply affected or shocked by the discovery of talking skull and he wanted to share it with someone who has power. Thirdly, it can also be seen as an act driven by ulterior motives. Maybe he seeks favor, fame, or financial reward. The king's response to Kagwa's report is notable for its slow and deliberate nature. His silent means two things. Either he is in disbelief or he is shocked beyond his imagination. Never since I was born of my mother have I seen or heard of a skull which spoke. The third stanza highlights the significance and seriousness of Kagwa's discovery. The king's order to send guards with Kagwa to find the talking skull indicates that he takes the matter seriously and wants to ensure that the report is investigated thoroughly. The king is making it clear that he expects the truth be told and that false claims will be met with severe consequences. This stanza depicts the journey of Kagwa and the two guards sent by the king to find the talking skull. The group has been riding into the forest for days and nights, and finally they come across the skull that Kagwa had discovered earlier. Kagwa addresses the skull, asking how it came to be in the forest. However, the skull remains silent. It does not respond to Kagwa's questions despite his repeated attempts to elicit a response. The talking skull that Kagwa had previously encountered has now become silent and unresponsive. The last stanza indicates the aftermath of Kagwa's encounter with the talking skull. The guards who had accompanied Kagwa to the forest become impatient with the skull's silence and decide to kill Kagwa. They killed him with sword and spear indicates that Kagwa had to face a brutal death. After Kagwa is killed, the talking skull suddenly speaks and asks Kagwa how he came to be in the forest. The dead Kagwa then answers, "Talking brought me here." This exchange between the talking skull and the dead Kagwa underscores the significance of the warning that the skull had given to Kagwa earlier. The talking skull had cautioned Kagwa about the dangers of recklessness and importance of being mindful of one's words and actions. In the end, it seems that Kagwa's failure to heed this warning led to his untimely death. What are the key themes discussed in the poem The Huntsman by Edward Lowbury? The very first theme is recklessness and its consequences. The poem emphasizes the importance of being mindful of one's words and actions, as recklessness can lead to disastrous consequences. Superstition and the supernatural. The talking skull in the poem is portrayed as the mysterious and otherworldly object that possesses a power beyond human understanding, highlighting the theme of superstition and the supernatural. Power and authority. The king in the poem is portrayed as a figure of power and authority, and his decision to send guards to investigate the talking skull underscores the theme of power and authority. Death and mortality. The poem deals with the themes of death and mortality, particularly in the context of Kagwa's untimely demise as a result of his recklessness. The Huntsman by Edward Lowbury employs a range of literary techniques to convey its themes and meaning. Imagery. The poem makes extensive use of imagery to create vivid descriptions of the forest, the hunting expedition, and the talking skull. For example, Kagwa hunted the lion through bush and forest when his spear creates a clear mental image of the hunter's journey through the dense vegetation. Symbolism. The talking skull is a powerful symbol that represents both the theme of mortality and the supernatural. It possesses a mysterious and mystical power beyond human comprehension. Foreshadowing. The talking skull's warning to Kagwa about the dangers of recklessness foreshadows his eventual demise. This technique adds to the sense of inevitability and tragedy that pervades the poem. Irony. The fact that Kagwa, a skilled hunter, is ultimately undone by his own recklessness is an example of irony. Repetition. The repetition of the line "talking brought me here" creates a sense of foreboding and reinforces the idea that recklessness can have dire consequences. Dialogues are a technique used to bring characters to life and convey their thoughts and emotions in a more direct way. In The Huntsman, the dialogue between Kagwa and the talking skull is a key element of the poem, as it helps to advance the plot and convey the theme of recklessness. Similarly, the use of simple diction is a technique that can help to create a sense of accessibility for the reader. By using simple diction, Lowbury is able to convey his message more directly and effectively. And that brings us to the end of today's session on Booktopia lessons. I hope you found it informative and educational. Thank you so much for tuning in. See you in the next lesson.